Swedenborg's Spiritual Hermeneutics by Corbin. The Spiritual Sense of the History of Adam. At the risk of oversimplification, it is necessary here to summarize Swedenborg's long and very dense pages as concisely as possible. Inasmuch as the place of a spiritual being is his internal state, the garden or paradise is therefore the celestial man himself, his internal state. The trees of that garden are all his possible perceptions of love and intelligence, of the good and the true. We have just seen the technical meaning of this, and it is decisive for what follows. But among these trees there is one that he must not touch on pain of death. On the level of spiritual hermeneutics, what does this mean? The celestial man, the man of the Antiquissima Ecclesia, had a direct perception of all the things of heaven through direct relations with the Lord and the angels, through revelations, visions, and dreams. What his mode of being permitted was the infinity of these perceptions derived from the divine principle active in him, but what his mode of being prohibited was making these perceptions derive from himself and from the world, that is, inquiring into the things of heaven by means of the things of the senses, things called scientifics, for then the celestial aspect of faith is destroyed. A desire to investigate the mysteries of faith by means of the things of sense and of scientifics was not only the cause of the fall of the posterity of the Antiquissima Ecclesia, as treated of in the 2nd chapter of Genesis, but it is also the cause of the fall of every church, for hence come not only falsities but also evils of life. Because the signification that thus bursts forth in this chapter of Genesis is perpetually immediate, let us be certain that we are clear as to what Swedenborg is saying. To understand heavenly things, suprasensory things, through the medium of sensory things is the approach of analogical understanding, of the perception of symbols. Of course, that is not what is referred to here, namely, the science of correspondences, which is, we have seen, the preeminent science, the science of sciences, which our theosopher, who was also a great man of science, himself practiced throughout his biblical commentaries, showing, for example, how the anatomy of the human brain can reveal for us analogically the topography of heaven as Homo Maximus. No, the fault here would be precisely to forget the approach of analogical reasoning, the anaphora, in order to require in its stead a scientific demonstration, reducing the analogous to the identical. The forbidden tree, the forbidden knowledge is what the person of this world lays claim to when he requires that evidence for the supersensory things of faith should be given to him by means of logical and empirical demonstration, without which he refuses them any adherence. Now this requirement and the knowledge that it postulates proceed from man's proprium, that is, from a person who is isolated from the principle, that is his life and his light. Such knowledge is also impossible because it would violate the order of things. It claims to assimilate rationally the suprasensory to the sensory, to eliminate the former by diminishing things to their sensory appearance, or reducing them to their mathematical equivalent, which is the exact opposite of analogical, that is, hermeneutical knowledge. This kind of knowledge receives its light from the threshold that it crosses, where life is. The other sort proceeds only from the man of this world, remains on this side of the world, and bears death within itself. In our day we know quite well how certain forecasts termed scientific claim to describe the future of humanity, all the while ignoring everything about the threshold that it is necessary for them to cross. Now, it is this drama that is recounted by the first 3 chapters of Genesis in the history of the Antiquissima Ecclesia from its first period, that of its flowering, when man was a celestial man, to the periods of its decline and disappearance. In order to grasp well the intentions of Swedenborgian hermeneutics, it is important to group together several essential features. The Antiquissima Ecclesia is the one that is designated as Homo, man in the abstract, who, as we already know, was created male and female, the signification of which we also know. The fall, the decline, and the disappearance of its posterity will be caused by an increasing attachment to what Swedenborg designates as the human proprium. What connection is there, then, between these two representations of Homo and his proprium? In Swedenborg's vocabulary, this latter word designates what belongs personally to an individual, his selfhood, his ipseity, Selbstheit. But this personal ipseity can be conscious of itself as inseparable from its principle. It is then transparent to it. The life and light that are within it are the life and light of its principle. This is the state that is expressed in Islamic spirituality by the saying, "He who knows himself knows his Lord," or else, on the contrary, it can regard itself as though it existed independently of its principle. It encloses itself within its fictitious autonomy, and at the same time it envelops itself with darkness and succumbs to annihilation and death. This is the key to the states of a person's proprium, of his ipseity, according to which he acts, in conformity with the schema of the anthropology that we already know, from the celestial person, the spiritual person, or the material person. For the last, his own self, his proprium, is absolutely everything. He does not imagine that he can continue to be if he loses it. For the second, the spiritual person, the feeling and the conviction that his principle, the Lord, is itself the power of thinking and acting within him constitute, in a way, theoretical knowledge. Only the first, the celestial person, has the actual perception of it. In addition, although he has no desire for it, a proprium, a self, is truly given to him. It is a self like that of an angel, who, in supreme serenity, tastes the joy of governing himself by a self, a proprium, where there are all things that are of the Lord himself. This is the true proprium, the celestial self, whereas that of the material person is the infernal self, hell itself. Thenceforth, events followed in rigorous succession. The posterity of the Antiquissima Ecclesia was not disposed to dwell alone, that is, to be guided by this internal proprium, this celestial self. Like another ecclesia later, it desired to be among the nations, and because it desired this, it is said, "It is not good that the man should be alone." Genesis 2:18. Then a deep sleep fell upon the man. Genesis 2:21. This sleep is the state into which man was led to the point that it seemed to him that he possessed his own ipseity, that he was himself by means of himself, a state that is in fact a deep sleep, because while he is in it, a person knows only that he lives, thinks, speaks, and acts from himself. When he begins to recognize the illusion of this, he rouses himself and wakes up as though emerging from a deep sleep. His waking from this sleep is, according to the biblical account, precisely the moment when the Lord, having fashioned one of the man's ribs into a woman, gave her to him. Genesis 2:22. The man was no longer alone. Of course, this is not a matter of some sort of surgical operation performed on the physical person of the individual atom, but it is a matter of one of the most profound arcana that there is to meditate upon. This rib, this element of the bony system that surrounds the chest and the heart, symbolizes the proprium of man, for as the angels of heaven see it, the proprium, the innermost self of man, appears as something bony, inanimate, like a dead and illusory thing, although it appears to man himself as something real. In fact, if life from his principle, the Lord, is withdrawn, he falls dead like a stone that falls. On the other hand, while he has within him, and knows that he has within him, life from his principle, the Lord, his proprium no longer appears like bone to the angels, but seems to them living flesh, that flesh of which it is written that it took the place of the rib. The woman, Eve, is therefore the proprium, the self of man, vivified by the Lord. That is why it is said not that the woman was created, but that the man's rib, his inmost self, his proprium, was fashioned into a woman. Let us return then to the previous exegesis of the verse that concerned not Adam the individual, but homo, male and female created he them. This exegesis teaches us that the masculine, or man, vir, signifies or symbolizes the intelligence, and everything that relates to it, consequently all things of wisdom and faith, while the feminine, or woman, signifies or symbolizes the will, consequently all things relating to love, and consequently relating to life, since life proceeds only from love. Now, the power designated as will is the nucleus, the inmost heart of the human being. It is also said that the tree of life, which is love, and from which faith derives, was in the midst of the garden, that is, in the will, the heart of the internal man. The feminine in the human being, or man's internal feminine, is therefore man's self, his proprium, but a self that is transparent to the principle that vivifies it. For as celestial man is constituted on the morning of the seventh day, he is homo, masculine and feminine. Mas femineus, said the alchemists. That is, although the word was not uttered by Swedenborg, his spiritual constitution was androgynous. More precisely, in Swedenborgian terms, the spiritual constitution of the androgyny persists in the celestial couple, and that is why it is said that the two members of that couple are a single angel, each being the reciprocal of the other. Yet the posterity of this homo inclined to a desire that was the reason for the divine remark. It is not good that the man should be alone. The formation of Eve thus symbolizes a process of exteriorizing, of objectifying the self of man, his proprium. That is why, in the first case, the feminine symbolizes the self, the proprium of the internal man. Thenceforth, it symbolizes the self, the proprium of the external man. Meditating attentively upon Swedenborg's dense pages, one cannot but recall the commentary of Jakob Böhme on these same verses of the book of Genesis, how Adam was separated from Sophia, the betrothed of his youth, his feminine self, and how Eve, his external feminine, was given to him in compensation. Eve is, then, before Adam's triumphant greeting, the betrothed and wife. Adam-Eve is the Sophianic couple because Eve is the proprium of Adam, his proprium vivified by the divine presence. The Adam-Eve couple has the perception of all the good of love and the truth of faith, and consequently possesses all wisdom and all intelligence in ineffable joy. This is what Swedenborg also finds signified in a verse of Jeremiah 31:22, where it is said, Jehovah hath created a new thing in the earth, a woman shall compass a man. It is the heavenly marriage that is signified in this passage also, he says, where by a woman is meant the self, the proprium vivified by the Lord, of which woman, the expression to compass, is predicated, because this proprium, this self, is such that it encompasses as a rib made flesh encompasses the heart. It is, however, just there, in that exteriorization of the self, of the very ipseity, or proprium, that the seed of danger is found. For the exteriorization of the proprium bore within itself the threat of desires for power, possessive desires that will be the destruction of celestial love and marriage. There is a striking parallelism between the drama of knowledge, the decline of human celestial consciousness, on the one hand, as Swedenborg finds it signified in the first chapters of Genesis, and, on the other hand, the contrast between celestial love and debauched, infernal love, a contrast that inspired one of his most beautiful books, a book that is one of the richest in doctrine and in vision, and one that perhaps conceals the very foundation of his thought. In the first celestial person, the internal person was so well differentiated from the external person that he perceived what belonged to the one and to the other, and he perceived how the Lord governs the external person by means of the internal person. His posterity, however, experienced an increasing desire for the proprium that belongs to the external person. Such a radical alteration ensued that people no longer even perceived the difference between the internal person and the external person, but imagined that one was indistinguishable from the other. Herein is the origin of that yearning to possess a knowledge that gives possession even of the inaccessible object, inaccessible to all knowledge other than a perception of the faith deriving from love. This yearning will be the death of the celestial person. Such was the destiny of the third posterity of the Antiquissima Ecclesia, doubt. It was the destiny of people who maintained that there should be no faith in revealed things, that the existence of supersensory spiritual worlds should not be accepted except on condition that they were seen and perceived by common empirical knowledge. The serpent, all kinds of serpents, in ancient times always designated those who had more trust in things presented to their senses than in revealed and supersensory things. Their guile has been increased even more in our time, when they command an entire arsenal of knowledge called scientific, which was unknown to the ancients. Sometimes it is the person who believes only his senses, sometimes it is the scientist, sometimes the philosopher. Here Swedenborg returns to his favorite theme, for his entire work, that of thinker and that of visionary, is testimony to the existence of a spiritual world more substantial, richer in images and forms, than the sensory world, whereas the deniers agree in rejecting its existence. They speak of the spirit in terms that they themselves do not understand. Cartesianism is particularly referred to here, for at best the philosopher consents in affirming that the spirit is of the thought. But then he removes from the spirit any substantiality that would make intelligible its independence with respect to the physical organism. All, therefore, have profaned and continue to profane the tree of knowledge by maintaining that knowledge of suprasensory things may be subjected to postulates, laws, and demonstrations of empirical knowledge. But being unable to succeed, they declare that suprasensory things are non-existent. It is precisely this that the celestial person of the Antiquissima Ecclesia refrained from doing at the beginning, but it is to this that his posterity succumbed. The change is indicated in an eloquent symbolism. At the beginning it is said, Genesis 2:9, that it was the tree of life that was in the center of the garden that man himself was. Then, during the conversation between the serpent and Eve, it is the tree of knowledge, the tree of which one must not eat, that is situated in the center of the garden, Genesis 2:17, 3:3. It is no longer the same person, or the same human state. The person for whom the tree of life is in the center of the garden is the person in whom love predominates, the person for whom all knowledge and all wisdom proceed from love. It is also by means of love that such a person knows what faith is. When that generation had disappeared, there was the person for whom it was no longer the tree of life, but the tree of knowledge, that was in the center of the garden. The order of forces is reversed. It is no longer by means of love that people have knowledge of the things of faith, but it is by means of knowledges of faith that they can also have knowledge of what love is, although among most there is rarely anything but a purely theoretical knowledge. This change now prepares the transition from antediluvian humanity to post-diluvian humanity, from the Antiquissima Ecclesia to the Antiqua Ecclesia, from the celestial person to the spiritual person. The character of the first was totally different from that of the second, but something of the celestial seed of the first passed into the second, at least among those who were saved from what is designated as the flood. The majority of others proceeded toward the catastrophe. The fourth posterity was the one that saw the tree was good for food. It comprised those who allowed themselves to be seduced by the love of self, considered their proprium, their self possessed in its own right and without transparence, as the source of their knowledge, and refused to believe in things revealed unless they saw them confirmed by the things of the senses, by logical or scientific knowledge. The nakedness that frightened them was precisely this, the surrender to their own ipseity. They found themselves stripped of intelligence and wisdom, because having believed that they had found the source of these in themselves, they found nothing there but the illusion of themselves. Thus they were naked with respect to the true and the good. The divine voice that they heard in the profaned garden was the interior voice, the last vestige of the celestial perception that they had possessed. Here again we observe a remarkable convergence with Ismaili gnosis, which interprets Adam's transgression as a breach in the relationship between Zahir and Batin, the external and the internal, the exoteric and the esoteric. Here the breach is consummated with the fifth posterity, expelled from paradise. Thereafter the cherubim prevented access to it. Before them is the flame of a turning sword, which is the love of self and its senseless desires, its persuasions that push man to want to re-enter paradise, but he is continually flung back toward material and terrestrial things. For the tree of knowledge having been profaned, henceforth it is access to the tree of life that is forbidden. The states of the Antiquissima Ecclesia were in the following succession. 1. Homo, in the state of oneness, masculine-feminine. 2. Externalization of ipseity, of the proprium, signified by the formation of Eve. 3. The appearance of doubt. 4. The fall. 5. The expulsion from paradise. The sixth and seventh posterities, Genesis 3:24, fell below the level of man. These exiles from paradise, whose corruption was even greater because they fell from a higher degree, were the people of the flood. Chapters 4 and 5 of the book of Genesis treat of the degeneration of the Antiquissima Ecclesia. The 10 names, Seth, Enoch, Kenan, etc., that are spread out in the course of chapter 5 up to Noah, signify not personal individuals, but doctrines, schools, stages in the decline of the Antiquissima Ecclesia, until finally no more remain except the small number described under the name of Noah as the Nova Ecclesia, re-emerging from the darkness.